The night Florence Redmond walked into the Millhaven Social, every man in the room forgot his own name. She stood in the doorway of the old Grange Hall for just a moment, smoothing the front of her pale blue dress with both hands in that self-conscious way a woman does when she knows she is being watched, but wishes she were not. The lanterns hanging from the rafters caught the copper in her dark hair and turned it to something close to fire, and the fiddle player missed a note for the first time all evening. She was 24 years old, the schoolteacher's daughter turned schoolteacher herself, and she had lived in Millhaven, Colorado her entire life without ever once causing the kind of silence that followed her through the door that warm June evening of 1882. The hall smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and the good clean sweat of people who had worked hard all week and intended to enjoy this one night thoroughly. Long tables had been pushed to the walls and draped in checkered cloth, and somebody's wife had arranged wildflowers in mason jars every few feet down their length. The fiddle recovered itself and launched back into a reel, and the floor was full of swirling couples, the women's skirts lifting like bells, the men red-faced and grinning. It was the kind of scene Florence had attended a dozen times before, and she knew almost every face in the room. Almost every face. She found her friend Della Marsh near the punch bowl and accepted the cup Della pressed into her hands without quite looking at it, because her eyes had already found the one person in the room she did not recognize, and some quiet, involuntary part of her was having difficulty looking away. He was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the cluster of men who had gathered there to talk cattle prices and drought, and he was doing what struck Florence as an unusual thing for a man at a social to do. He was simply watching, not the women specifically, not any one person in particular, but the whole scene, with the unhurried attention of a man studying something he finds genuinely interesting rather than something he is hunting. He held a tin cup loosely in one hand and his hat in the other, and he had not put the hat on a hook with everyone else's, which told Florence he was either newly arrived or not yet sure he was staying. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from actual labor rather than show, and his face was angular and weathered in a way that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. He might have been 30 or a little past it, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He was not the most handsome man Florence had ever seen, but there was something in the set of him, in the stillness he carried, that made the handsomer men in the room seem somehow louder and less substantial by comparison. "Who is that?" Florence said, and it came out less like a question and more like a thought escaping. Della craned her neck cheerfully. Della had been married for 4 years and considered it her personal calling to see Florence similarly situated. "Calvin Brenner," she said, with the satisfied tone of someone producing a gift. "He bought the old Harker place 2 months ago, 300 acres on the South Fork, runs cattle, does some horse work. He kept to himself all spring, but Tom said he came to the church fundraiser last week and gave generously." She paused. "He is not married." "I did not ask if he was married," Florence said. "No," Della agreed pleasantly, "but you were about to." Florence drank her punch and made a point of turning her attention to the dancers. The evening moved in the way these evenings always moved, which was to say it moved pleasantly and a little predictably. The fiddle player was joined by a man with a banjo and another with a squeeze box, and the music grew livelier. Florence danced twice with Henry Alcott, who was a perfectly agreeable young man but who talked exclusively about the price of lumber, and once with old Reverend Marsh, Della's father-in-law, who danced with every woman in the room as a matter of principle, and whose cheerful presence made it impossible to feel anything but warmly charitable toward the world. In between the dances, she noticed that Calvin Brenner continued to stand near the wall. This was remarkable, because men at the Millhaven Social asked women to dance with the same compulsive regularity with which they ate at mealtimes. It was simply what you did. Even the shy ones asked. Even the ones with 2 left feet asked. There was a kind of social machinery to these evenings that everyone participated in, and the machinery included men crossing the floor and women accepting or declining, and the whole thing running along like a well-oiled wheel. Calvin Brenner had not asked anyone to dance. Florence was not certain why she kept noticing this. She was dancing herself, after all, and laughing at the right moments and admiring the wildflower centerpieces, and doing all the things a woman was supposed to do at a social. She was having a perfectly fine time, but somewhere at the edge of her awareness, she was tracking the man by the wall the way you track a sound you cannot quite identify, waiting for it to either resolve into something familiar or confirm itself as something entirely new. Gerald Potts asked her to dance during the fourth reel. Gerald was a land speculator from Denver who had been in Millhaven for 3 weeks and who had made it abundantly clear to Florence and anyone else who would listen that he considered himself a considerable catch. He danced enthusiastically and without particular skill, and he kept his hand on her waist in a way that was just firm enough to be presumptuous without being quite actionable, and he talked about his Denver office and his business prospects with the serene confidence of a man who mistakes attention for admiration. Florence smiled and nodded and counted the measures until the song ended. She was returning to the punch bowl when she became aware that the space near the far wall was empty. She turned, scanning the room with what she hoped was a casual expression, and found that Calvin Brenner had moved. He was standing closer now, near one of the support posts, and he was watching her. Not the room, her. Florence did not look away immediately, which surprised her, and he did not look away either, which surprised her more. It was the kind of mutual acknowledgement that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but felt longer. The way a candle flame looks larger in a dark room than it actually is. Then someone stepped between them and the moment dissolved, and Florence turned back to the punch bowl and found that her cup needed refilling rather urgently. Della appeared at her elbow with the expression of a woman heroically restraining herself from comment. "Not a word," Florence said. "I have said nothing whatsoever," Della replied and refilled her cup. 3 more dances passed. Florence danced with Della's husband Tom, who was a good dancer and a kind man, and with young Jacob Hurst, who was barely 19 and so nervous about the whole enterprise that Florence spent the entire song quietly coaching him through the steps, which she found more charming than any amount of confident footwork. She was laughing at something Jacob had said when she felt rather than saw that someone had stopped just beside her. She turned. Calvin Brenner was standing close enough that she could see the particular shade of his eyes, which were gray-green, the color of sage in morning light, and that his expression was serious but not unfriendly. He had put his hat on at some point, which meant he had gone outside and come back in, and there was the faint, clean smell of night air about him. He looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was entirely without the performative pleasantries that men at socials usually deployed, and she had the sudden distinct impression that whatever he was about to say, he had thought about carefully before saying it. "Miss Redmond," he said. His voice was quiet and low, the kind of voice that carried without effort. "You know my name," she said, which was not the most brilliant thing she had ever said, but it came out before she could refine it. "I asked," he said simply. She waited. Around them the music played and couples swirled, and the Millhaven Social continued its cheerful revolution, but Florence felt very still at the center of it. "I have been watching this evening," he said, "and I think you are not having as good a time as everyone seems to believe you are." Florence opened her mouth and closed it again. "I do not mean that unkindly," he added, with something that was almost the beginning of a smile. "I think you are being very gracious about it. But there is a difference between being gracious and being glad, and you look to me like a woman who would rather be somewhere else." She should have been offended. She was not entirely certain why she was not. "And where do you suppose I would rather be?" she asked. "I do not know," he said, "but I thought perhaps you might agree to leave with me and we could find out." The fiddle sang. The floor moved. Someone laughed loudly near the door. Florence Redmond stood in the middle of the Millhaven Social in her pale blue dress, and looked at this man she had known for approximately 45 seconds, and everything in her that was sensible and cautious and appropriately aware of what was proper lined up on one side of her heart, and everything in her that was tired of lumber prices and Gerald Potts's hand on her waist lined up on the other. "Yes," she said. She said it so quickly she was not entirely sure she had said it until she saw something shift in his expression, a kind of quiet satisfaction that was not smug but was deeply genuine, as if she had answered a question he had not been entirely certain of the answer to. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked toward the door, and Della Marsh, watching from across the room with a mason jar of wildflowers in her hand, pressed her lips together in an expression that was half delight and half very firmly restrained triumph. The night outside the Grange Hall was immense and dark and full of stars. Florence had lived under these Colorado skies her whole life, and yet she never quite got used to the scale of them. The way the darkness above the mountains made you feel both very small and very specifically located in the universe, as if the stars had arranged themselves around your exact position. The music from the hall was muffled now, reaching them in waves as the door swung behind them, and the air was cool and smelled of the creek somewhere below the hill and of pine and of the horses tied at the rail. Calvin Brenner stopped when they reached the edge of the lamplight that spilled from the hall windows, and he turned to face her with his hat in his hands again. "I should tell you," he said, "that I did not have a specific destination in mind. I only knew that you looked like you needed air." Florence laughed. It came out fully and without restraint, the kind of laugh she did not usually allow herself in polite company because she had been told once, not unkindly, that it was somewhat larger than a lady's laugh strictly needed to be. Calvin Brenner looked, if anything, pleased by it. "That is either the most honest thing a man has ever said to me at a social," she told him, "or the strangest." "Probably both," he agreed. They walked without discussing where they were walking, which Florence found she did not mind at all. There was a path that ran along the side of the hill behind the Grange Hall, used mostly by children during the day, and they followed it by the light of the moon and the habit of feet that knew uneven ground. The grass was dry and sweet-smelling, still holding some warmth from the day, and the sounds of the social faded gradually behind them until it was just the fiddle, very distant, and then just the night. "You bought the Harker place," Florence said, when the silence had stretched from comfortable into the territory of something she wanted to fill. "I did. Tom Marsh said you have been working it all spring." "I have." He glanced at her sideways. "The south pasture needed refencing. The hay barn had a bad roof. Things pile up when a place sits empty." "Were you somewhere else before?" she asked. It was, she recognized, a question that meant more in the West of 1882 than it did on the surface. Men came west for all manner of reasons, and not all of those reasons were things they wanted to discuss, and you learned to read the pauses. His pause was brief and not evasive. "Kansas," he said. "Before that, Missouri. My family had a farm in Missouri. My father died when I was 22 and my mother went to live with my sister in St. Louis, and the farm went to debts." He said this without self-pity, the way you describe weather. "I spent 5 years in Kansas working other men's cattle, saved what I could, looked for the right place. And Millhaven was the right place. The land was right," he said. Then, after a moment, "I am still deciding about the rest of it." Florence considered this. The path curved around a stand of aspens and she could see the creek below them, catching the moonlight in broken silver pieces. She had walked this path 100 times since childhood, and yet it looked different tonight, or perhaps she was different, or perhaps it was simply that everything looked different when you were walking it with a person you had not previously known existed. "Why did you not ask me to dance?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I did not want to dance with you," he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "Dancing is a fine thing, but you learn a great deal more about a person in 10 minutes of honest conversation than you do in an hour of being spun in circles. Most men would not make that distinction. Most men are not me. he said simply and walked on. Florence stood for 1 second looking at his back, and then she followed him. And she was smiling in the dark in the way you smile when you are alone and do not need to perform it for anyone. They sat for a while on a flat rock above the creek and talked, and later Florence would find it difficult to reconstruct the exact sequence of what was said, because the conversation moved the way good conversations do, which is without any particular plan, one thing leading naturally into the next. She told him about the school, about the 40-odd children she taught in the single-room building on the north end of town, about the ones who were quick, and the ones who struggled, and the one small girl, Pearl Hutchins, who had arrived in March knowing nothing at all and who by June could read 3-letter words with utter fierce precision, and looked each time as if she had personally conquered a continent. He listened to all of this with real attention, not the polite performance of attention, but the genuine kind, asking questions that showed he had actually heard what she said rather than merely waited for his turn to speak. In return, he told her about horses, which was clearly where his truest enthusiasm lived. He had a gift for it, he said without boasting, just stating a fact, and he could see things in the way a horse moved that other men missed, could read the hitch of a leg or the set of an ear and know what it meant. He had broken horses in Kansas and done it well, but he wanted eventually to do something more considered than breaking. He wanted to train them, really train them, build something with them rather than just subdue them. There is a difference, he said, between a horse that has been beaten into compliance and a horse that has been persuaded to trust you. Florence thought about that for a long time after he said it. When they walked back toward the Grange Hall, the social was winding down, couples filtering out into the night with the flushed and slightly dazed look of people returning from a good dream. Della found Florence immediately with eyes that asked about 17 questions at once, and Florence answered exactly none of them with anything other than an expression that she hoped conveyed composed dignity, and that she suspected conveyed nothing of the sort. Calvin Brenner shook hands with Tom Marsh and accepted a brief introduction to Reverend Marsh, and retrieved his horse from the rail with the easy economical movements of a man entirely comfortable with himself. He brought his horse around before he left and stopped near Florence. "I would like to call on you," he said. Not a question precisely, but not an assumption either. Something in between, carefully weighted. "Sunday," she said. "I teach until Friday, and Saturday I keep house." He nodded once. "Sunday," he agreed. He put his hat on and touched the brim, and then he rode south toward his 300 acres on the South Fork, and Florence watched him go, and Della's hand found her elbow. "Tell me everything," Della said. "Good night, Della," Florence said. He came on Sunday as he had said he would, which was itself notable because Florence had been told by enough people that men were unreliable in the follow-through that she had arrived at a cautious policy of not expecting things until they actually occurred. Calvin Brenner knocked on the door of the small house she rented on Crane Street at 2 in the afternoon with a bunch of Indian paintbrush he had clearly picked from somewhere along the road rather than purchased, and which Florence found she liked immeasurably better for that. Her father was visiting that day. Thomas Redmond was 61 years old and had come out to Colorado from Ohio 25 years ago with his wife and a wagon full of books and more optimism than judgment. And the optimism had been largely correct, and he had built a good life and raised a good daughter and retired the previous year from his 30 years of teaching at the Millhaven school, which his daughter now ran in his place. He was a small, sharp-eyed man who moved slowly and thought quickly, and regarded most things in the world with the charitable skepticism of someone who has seen enough of it to know that most things are neither as bad as feared, nor as good as hoped. He looked Calvin Brenner over in the doorway with an expression Florence could not quite read. Calvin Brenner said, "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Calvin Brenner. I have recently acquired the Harker property on the South Fork." He paused. "I came to see your daughter." Thomas Redmond was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in then," he said. They sat in the front room, the three of them, And Calvin answered Thomas Redmond's questions with the same uncomplicated directness he had turned on Florence 2 nights earlier. And Thomas asked the kind of questions that were really about character rather than circumstance, the kind that circled around what sort of man a man was rather than what sort of assets he possessed. And Calvin seemed to understand this and answered accordingly. He spoke about his work with respect for it, but without any puffery. He spoke about his intentions with the Harker place carefully and practically. When Thomas asked him what he thought made a man trustworthy, Calvin was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think it is about doing the thing you said you would do, even when it becomes inconvenient." Thomas looked at his daughter and then back at Calvin and said, "Well, I believe Florence knows her own mind." After Thomas left, Florence and Calvin walked to the creek along the south road, and the afternoon was very warm and the cottonwood trees threw long shadows, and Florence discovered that 2 nights of sleep had not diminished anything she had felt on the hillside above the Grange Hall. If anything, it had sharpened it, given it the quality of something real and confirmed rather than something wished for. They talked about the school board, which was currently engaged in a dispute over textbooks that Florence found both frustrating and slightly absurd. They talked about the summer drought, which was a real concern for the ranches south of town. He told her that he had a mare who was due to foal in August and that he was watching her carefully. And there was something in the way he described the mare, with a particular quiet fondness, that told Florence more about him than anything else she had heard him say. He asked her why she had chosen to stay in Millhaven when she might have gone somewhere larger for her education and her career. It was a question that surprised her slightly, not because it was impertinent, but because most people in Millhaven assumed the answer was simply that she was a Millhaven person and had never really thought about it. Calvin Brenner clearly did not assume this. She told him the truth, which was that she had thought about it considerably. She had corresponded with a school in Denver about a position there 3 years ago, and she had been offered the position, and she had declined it. She had declined it partly because of her father, who was beginning to slow, and partly because of the school here, which needed a dedicated teacher and not just a temporary one, but partly for a reason she found harder to articulate, which was that she loved the particular quality of this place, the way the mountains looked at dawn, the specific sound of this creek, the names she knew and that knew her. Most people would call that small thinking, she said, with a slight edge that dared him to agree. "I would call it knowing what you value," he said, without any drama, and that was that. By the end of that afternoon, Florence understood that she was in significant trouble, in the best possible sense of the word, and that Calvin Brenner was not going to be something that simply passed through her life like the land speculators and the traveling ministers, and the other briefly present figures that appeared and disappeared from Millhaven with the regularity of weather. He called again the following Sunday, and the one after that. By the third Sunday they had stopped going to the creek, and he was staying to supper instead, and Florence had discovered that he was a capable and unself-conscious participant in the domestic mechanics of meal preparation, rolling up his sleeves and peeling potatoes with the same unhurried competence he apparently brought to everything, and that she found this unreasonably attractive. Della, who came to call on a Tuesday in July with a pie and entirely transparent motivations, sat at the kitchen table and asked Florence directly how things stood. Florence was braiding her hair and thinking about the letter she needed to write to the school board about the textbook situation, and also about what Calvin had said on Sunday about the south pasture fence line, and whether it was possible to be in love with a person after 3 weeks, and whether love was even the right word for what was happening to her, which felt more like the sensation of a country you had always heard about, and now found yourself actually standing in. "I do not know how things stand," she told Della honestly. "Does he look at you?" Della asked, and then, before Florence could respond to the vagueness of this, "The way Tom looks at me when I walk into a room. Like you are the specific thing he has been looking for." Florence set down the braid and looked at her hands. "Yes," she said, Della nodded as if a theorem had been proven. "Well then," she said. In July, the drought tightened its grip on the valley south of Millhaven, and the talk among the ranchers grew serious. The creek dropped to a third of its usual level, and the grass went brown and crackling in the pastures, and the cattle looked drawn and the horses were restless. There was a meeting at the Grange Hall, the same building where the social had been held, now stripped of its wild flowers and checkered cloth, and the men sat in rows and discussed water rights and the possibility of driving cattle north toward better grazing. Florence attended, which caused a certain amount of notice, because it was primarily a meeting for the ranching community, and she was a schoolteacher. But her father was too unwell to come, and had asked her to go in his stead, because Thomas Redmond had a small interest in the community garden irrigation channel that ran near the school building, and Florence was not the sort of woman who declined to do something on the grounds that it was primarily attended by men. Calvin saw her when she came in, and moved to create a space for her near the middle of the room without making any fuss about it. She sat beside him and felt him very present at her left side and paid attention to the meeting, which was complicated and occasionally heated. And when a man named Rourke began talking about diverting the creek tributary in a way that would cut off the irrigation channel, Florence raised her hand and spoke clearly about the community garden's water rights, which were documented and legal. And several people looked at her with the mild surprise of people who forget that women are capable of specificity, and Rourke retreated from his position. Walking out afterward, Calvin said, "That was well done," and he said it the way he said most things, plainly and without embellishment, and Florence felt it settle somewhere in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. "I have documentation," she said. "You had more than documentation," he said. "You had certainty. That is different." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the evening light was falling orange across the rooftops of Millhaven, and everything was very warm and very specific, and Florence thought, with the peculiar clarity of moments that you know you will remember, that she was standing in exactly the right place. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in late July, at the end of a walk that had taken them further south than they usually went, up onto a bluff above the creek, where the view of the mountains opened up wide and blue-white and enormous. They had been sitting on the grass in companionable quiet for some time, the kind of quiet that had become, over these weeks, one of the things Florence valued most about his company, the fact that he did not feel compelled to fill silence, that he understood silence as a form of conversation in its own right. She had been watching a hawk work the thermals above the valley floor, and he had been watching her, and when she turned and found him doing so, neither of them looked away this time. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gesture of such particular tenderness that Florence felt her breath stop entirely for a moment. And then he leaned forward and kissed her, carefully and entirely without uncertainty, and Florence kissed him back with everything she had, and the hawk continued to work the thermals, and the mountain stood enormous and indifferent in the distance. And Florence Redmond understood that she was completely and irrevocably in love with Calvin Brenner. They were apart for the whole of August. It was not planned, but it was unavoidable. One of the families on the outer edge of the Millhaven school district, the Larson family, had a daughter who was desperately ill with a fever that had taken hold in early August, and that had the whole community frightened. Florence organized the practical elements of the community response, which meant coordinating food and medicine, and the schedule of people sitting with the family, and it absorbed her completely for 2.5 weeks. She sent Calvin a note explaining this, and he sent one back that said he understood, that he was managing the water situation on the South Fork, that the mare had foaled successfully and the foal was healthy, and that he thought about her. That last sentence, written in his plain and careful hand, she read several times. Ellen Larson survived her fever, thin and pale and exhausted, and was carried out to sit in the sun in the first week of September, and Florence watched her from the road, and felt the particular relief that comes when something you were afraid of losing turns out not to be lost. Calvin came to supper the following Sunday, and he looked at Florence across the table in the lamplight, and she looked back, and something had shifted between them without anything being said. The way a season turns not on a specific day, but somewhere in the middle of a night when the temperature drops 2 degrees, and in the morning everything is different. He proposed to her in October, when the aspens had gone gold along the creek, and the air had the sharp, clean quality of autumn mornings. He came on a Saturday, which was unusual, and he arrived with a deliberateness she recognized, the same quality he brought to everything he considered important. They walked to the aspens along the creek, and he stopped and turned to her and he said, "Florence, I would like to marry you if you are willing." No preamble, no orchestration, just the statement, direct and fully meant, and his gray-green eyes very steady on her face. Florence had been expecting this and had not been expecting it, which is the nature of the things we want most. She felt the whole weight of it, the realness of it, the way the right things always feel heavier and more substantial than we imagine them feeling when we imagine them from a distance. "I am willing," she said, completely and without reservation. He took a ring from his coat pocket then, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, and he told her it had been his mother's, and his mother had given it to him when he left Missouri and told him to give it to the right woman. He put it on her finger and she looked at it and then at him, and the aspens shook in the wind and sent a cascade of golden leaves through the air around them. And Florence Redmond laughed her too large laugh and put her arms around Calvin Brenner's neck and kissed him with thorough sincerity. Thomas Redmond sat in his chair in the front room when they came to tell him, and looked at them both for a long, careful moment. He had watched this develop across the preceding months with the same precise attention he brought to books, and he had seen his daughter in the evenings after Calvin's visits, the way she moved through the kitchen with something extra in her, some additional quality of aliveness that he had not seen in her before, and that he recognized as the particular thing that happened to a person when they were loved by the right person. "You have my full blessing," he told Calvin, and then he got up from his chair, which cost him some effort these days, and shook the man's hand. The wedding was planned for April of 1883, which gave them the winter to prepare, and the winter was long and beautiful and full of the particular happiness of a life that has found its shape. Florence kept teaching and Calvin kept working the South Fork, and they saw each other on Sundays and wrote letters during the week, because they were far enough apart that letters were useful, and because Calvin turned out to be a person who wrote well, with the same directness he brought to speech, but with an additional quality of care that the written word required, and Florence kept every letter in a box on her bedside table and read them in the evenings. The letters were full of the practical details of their separate lives, the fence that needed mending, the progress of the school board dispute which was finally resolved in November in Florence's favor, the new family that had arrived in town from Nebraska with 7 children, including a set of twins, who immediately became Florence's favorite students on the grounds that they appeared to share a single unified opinion on everything, and expressed it with tremendous force. There were also other things in the letters, quieter things, the things that you say on paper to the person you intend to spend your life with, the things that make an ordinary paragraph suddenly very necessary to read twice. In February, the temperature dropped so severely that school was canceled for a week, and Calvin rode into town 3 times instead of once, and Florence made soup on the iron stove, and they sat by the fire in the small front room with Thomas Redmond dozing in his chair. And Calvin read aloud from the Ohio newspaper Thomas received monthly, and outside the window the snow came down steady and continuous, and Florence thought she had never in her life felt so entirely and specifically content. There were difficulties, as there always are, and they were not trivial. Gerald Potts reappeared in Millhaven in February with some story about expanded business interests, and spent a week making himself visible in ways that Florence found transparent and mildly tiresome. He called at the school one afternoon and expressed surprise at the news of her engagement, and offered, with enormous condescension, his opinion that she might be acting hastily. Florence thanked him for his concern in the tone of voice she used for students who were very confident of wrong answers, and Gerald Potts left Millhaven again within the week, evidently finding the business interests less compelling than he had supposed. There was also a more serious matter. A man named Dutton, who had a claim on some grazing land adjacent to the South Fork, began making noise about water rights in March, in a manner that was not entirely civil. He rode onto Calvin's property twice without invitation and spoke in terms that were meant to be threatening, about how the area had its way of doing things and newcomers who did not understand those ways tended to have difficulties. Calvin listened to this on both occasions without raising his voice or his fists, and then he went to the county seat and spent 2 days in the land office, and he came back with documentation that established his water rights beyond contestation, and he had the county sheriff serve Dutton with a formal notice, and that was the end of it. But Florence had been frightened, in the way that people in 1882 in Colorado were rightfully frightened of disputes that could turn violent, and she told Calvin so. He listened to her fear with full seriousness. He did not dismiss it or minimize it. He said, "I will not pretend there was no risk. But I have learned that most men who threaten are testing to see if you will back down, and the best answer to that test is to stand on legal ground and hold it." He paused. "I will also tell you that I intend to keep my rifle loaded and visible. I am not naive." She looked at him. "I do not want anything to happen to you," she said, and she meant it with a force that surprised her slightly, the force of the thing you do not quite admit to yourself until it is demanded. "Nothing is going to happen to me," he said. "I have considerable plans for the future." He looked at her with an expression that was almost a smile. "You are in most of them." April came with an extravagance of wildflowers and the particular relief that follows a hard winter in the high country. The wedding was held on the 14th, in the Millhaven church, which was a modest building with good windows that admitted the spring sunlight in long slanted bars across the plank floor. Della Marsh had organized flowers from 3 different families' gardens and arrayed them along the pews with an enthusiasm that turned the small church into something approaching a meadow. Reverend Marsh officiated with his usual cheerful gravity and spoke about the particular courage it took to commit yourself to another person, and the particular grace that came from receiving that commitment in return. Florence walked to the altar in a dress she had made herself from pale ivory muslin, with her hair done up and the garnet ring on her left hand, and she saw Calvin standing at the front of the church in his best suit, which was dark wool and well-fitted, and his hair was neatly cut for the occasion, and he watched her come down the aisle with an expression of such undisguised and complete regard that Florence felt her eyes sting and made herself breathe slowly to prevent any undignified display. She stood beside him and they looked at each other, and everything else in the room became peripheral, as it does in those moments when the thing you have been moving toward arrives and is exactly what it was supposed to be. Thomas Redmond sat in the front pew and wept quietly and made no attempt to conceal it, and Della Marsh, beside him, handed him a handkerchief with the efficiency of a woman who had anticipated this development. The vows were the traditional ones, and they were said with the full weight of people who understood what they were promising, and the Reverend pronounced them married, and Calvin kissed her in the church for the first time, in front of God and 35 friends and neighbors and Thomas Redmond, with complete and unashamed tenderness, and Florence kissed him back with the same, and the whole room seemed to exhale simultaneously. The reception was in the Grange Hall, which Della had again transformed with flowers and checkered cloth and wildflowers in mason jars, and there was a fiddle player and a banjo player and a man with a squeeze box, and the dancing was lively and extended. And this time Florence danced with her husband, which was a word she had been thinking experimentally for months and which had now become true. And Calvin danced with the composed but genuine effort of a man who did not particularly love dancing, but was doing it for purposes that transcended the activity itself. Florence's father danced with her once, holding both her hands and moving in the careful elderly way he had, and she saw 25 years of her life in his face and felt the particular sweetness of continuity, of being both the thing that was begun and the thing that was beginning. Young Jacob Hurst danced with Pearl Hutchins, who was 9 and had come with her parents and who danced with the same fierce precision she brought to three-letter words, and everyone laughed and nobody made it unkind. When the evening had gone long and the musicians were beginning to look tired, and the children had fallen asleep in corners wrapped in their parents' coats, Florence and Calvin slipped out the back of the Grange Hall into the April night. The stars were extraordinary. She took his hand and they stood in the darkness and looked at the sky, and the music reached them faintly through the hall's walls, and the mountains were great dark shapes against the darkness, and Florence pressed her shoulder against his and felt the solid, warm reality of him, and thought that there were things in life that exceeded your expectations not by being different from what you imagined, but by being more fully themselves than imagination could manage. "We should go home," he said quietly. She liked enormously the word home said in that particular way. "Yes," she said, "let us go home." Life on the South Fork had a quality that Florence, coming to it from the rhythms of the town schoolteacher, found both demanding and deeply satisfying. The house was sound but had needed the attention of a woman's eye, and Florence gave it that attention without diminishing it into mere domesticity, turning it into something that was practical and warm and specifically theirs. She kept teaching, because neither she nor Calvin had any notion that marriage should end her work, and the school board, which had learned to treat Florence Redmond's opinions with considerable respect, raised no objection. The mornings were early, because cattle and horses set their own schedules, and Florence developed the ability to be fully awake and functional at 5 in the morning, with the pragmatic adaptability she brought to most things. She would hear Calvin in the barn before she was dressed, talking to the horses in the low, quiet voice he used with them, and she would make coffee and stand in the kitchen doorway with her cup and watch the sunrise come over the eastern ridge, and it was one of the best things she knew. Calvin's mare from the previous summer had produced a foal he had named simply Gray, because the colt was a precise dove gray without a single other color on him, and Gray was growing well and showing the kind of disposition that Calvin described as promising. He had acquired 2 more horses since the wedding, both of them horses that other owners had given up on, one because of a bad habit of shying at shadows, and one because of a persistent unwillingness to be saddled, and Calvin worked with both of them with the patience of a man who genuinely did not consider himself to be in a race. Florence watched him work the horses sometimes in the evenings after school, sitting on the top rail of the paddock fence, and she never grew tired of it. There was something in the way he moved around them, with complete calm and absolute consistency, that was its own kind of eloquence. The shying horse stopped shying over the course of 3 months. The unwilling horse accepted the saddle and eventually seemed to consider it unremarkable. When they were done with their sessions, Calvin would come and lean on the fence beside her, and they would talk about her day and his day, and the way the weather was changing, and the horses would drift in the evening light, and everything was exactly right. Thomas Redmond's health declined through the summer of 1883, not dramatically but steadily, in the way of someone whose years have finally begun to accumulate interest. Calvin drove Florence into town every Sunday to see him, and on the days she could not go, he went himself, sitting with the old man in his front room and reading to him from whatever book was currently on the side table. Florence came home from her own visits sometimes with the particular quiet that settles on a person who is holding grief at arm's length, keeping it from being premature but knowing it is waiting, and Calvin would take her hand and simply be present, without requiring her to be anything in particular. Thomas Redmond died in September of 1883, peaceful and without apparent distress, in his own bed with Florence holding his hand and Calvin sitting in the chair by the window. He left Florence his books, every one of them, which filled 4 crates and occupied 2 additional bookshelves that Calvin built against the south wall of the sitting room, and he left her the house on Crane Street, and he left her the particular inheritance of a man who had spent his life paying attention to the things that mattered. Florence grieved her father honestly and thoroughly, without performing recovery she did not feel. Calvin gave her the space for this and the company for this, knowing without being told which she needed at any given moment. And this, Florence thought during those weeks, was the truest measure of the man she had married. In the spring of 1884, Florence told Calvin on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table over coffee that she believed she was expecting a child. He set his cup down very carefully and looked at her. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am nearly certain," she said. "I will see the doctor today." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, and Florence saw in his face something she had not seen before exactly, a deeper layer of the tenderness she already knew, something that was about the future and the weight of it and the willingness to hold it. "I am glad," he said. He said it with a quiet that contained a great deal. "So am I," she said. The doctor confirmed it that afternoon. She was about 3 months along, which meant the child would arrive in October. She rode home in the afternoon light with her hands on the reins and her heart full of the peculiar mixture of elation and terror that attends any real change, any door that opens into something irreversible and necessary. Calvin had finished early and was in the kitchen when she came in, and he looked at her face and she nodded, and he crossed the room and put his arms around her with a completeness that she felt in every part of herself. "October," she said, into his shoulder. "October," he said. They had a son in October, as the aspen leaves were coming down again and the mornings were sharp with the first cold. The birth was long and not easy, and Calvin sat outside the bedroom door for 11 hours with the particular controlled stillness of a man who is frightened and refusing to let the fear run him. And when the doctor finally opened the door and told him everything was well, Florence saw something release in him that she had not quite seen him hold. She was lying in bed when he came in, tired in a way that went all the way to her bones, and their son was in the crook of her arm, very new and very small, looking at the ceiling with the unfocused seriousness of the recently arrived. "He is healthy," she told Calvin, who was sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at the child with the same quality of attention he gave to everything he found genuinely remarkable. "So are you," he said. "Thank God." "What shall we name him?" she said. Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree." Florence looked at her husband and then at her son, and her eyes were full. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Brenner was a loud and emphatic infant who grew into a loud and emphatic toddler with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes, and a disposition that suggested he had arrived with strong opinions about everything and intended to share them. He was funny and stubborn and prone to following his father around the property with the dogged determination of a very small general, convinced that all operations require his supervision, and Calvin bore this with the same patience he brought to horses, which turned out to be entirely appropriate. Florence continued to teach for 2 more years after Thomas arrived, and then she stepped back from the schoolroom, not because anyone required her to, but because her hands were full and she found that she wanted them to be. She recommended a young woman from Denver named Clara Briggs for the position, who arrived with 4 trunks of books and a fierce intelligence, and immediately earned the school board's respect by telling them calmly at the first meeting that she would make her own decisions about textbooks, and Florence felt entirely satisfied with this. She did not stop teaching. She taught Thomas, and later, she taught the children of their neighbors on the South Fork, holding informal sessions in the sitting room surrounded by her father's books, and she corresponded with Clara Briggs about curriculum and methods, and argued warmly in letters about the best approach to teaching reading, which is an argument that teachers have always found inexhaustible. In the summer of 1886, a second child arrived. A girl this time, with Calvin's features and Florence's particular expression of determined assessment, and they named her Catherine after Calvin's mother, who was still living in St. Louis and who wrote back to the letter announcing the birth with the specific delight of a grandmother, receiving precisely the news she had been hoping for. Calvin wrote to his mother regularly, and she to him, and Florence had developed, through letters, a genuine affection for Mary Brenner, who turned out to be a woman of wit and precision who sent books for the children, and asked excellent questions and expressed opinions about everything from the drought to the school board, to the correct method for canning tomatoes with equal confidence. The Harker property had become something Calvin was proud of, which he expressed in the understated way of a man who shows his pride through his work rather than his words. The fencing was all good. The hay barn had a new roof and then a new addition. The herd had grown to a size that provided well. The horse work had expanded into something that drew people from neighboring counties, ranchers and farmers who had heard that the man at the South Fork had a way with difficult horses, and Calvin had hired a young hand named Eli, 17 years old and eager and completely without fear, whom he taught with the same thorough patience he brought to the horses themselves. Eli became part of the household in the way that people do when you live at a distance from town, and proximity creates its own kind of family. He ate supper with them most evenings and played with Thomas in the yard, and was appointed by Catherine, once she was old enough to make such appointments, as her designated carrier for all distances over 10 feet, an office he accepted with bemused good humor. He wrote to his own family in New Mexico on Sundays, and Florence looked the address over once and asked if the family was doing well, and he said they were managing, and she heard something in the managing that she filed away and returned to later. There was a bad winter in 1887 that killed a portion of the herd and damaged the second hay barn and kept Florence and Calvin and the children inside for long stretches in a way that tested everyone's patience and resourcefulness. They played every game they knew and invented new ones. Calvin carved wooden horses for Thomas and Catherine with a pocket knife by the fire in the evenings, working with the concentration he brought to everything, and Florence read aloud in the long afternoons, her father's books finding their second life in the warm room while the snow came down relentless outside. They had their disagreements, as any two people who live together honestly and closely must. Florence had a temper she was not always successful at managing, and Calvin had a stubbornness that was usually an asset and occasionally was not, and there were arguments of the real kind, not performative, in which both of them were genuinely frustrated with the other and said things with more heat than accuracy. But they had also developed, without planning it, the habit of coming back to each other, not just resolving the argument but returning to the actual person and the actual love, and understanding that the argument was not the definition of either of them. There was one evening in November of that bad winter when they had argued about a decision Calvin had made about the herd without consulting her, a decision that she thought was right but that she had not been included in, and she had told him in very precise terms what she thought about being excluded from decisions that affected their life. He had listened, and he had been quiet for a while, and then he had said, "You are right. I am sorry." And she had stood in the kitchen looking at him, and thought that the ability to do that, simply and without defense, was one of the things she loved most about him. The spring after the bad winter came with an almost defiant generosity, and the grass on the South Fork came in thick and green, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the surviving cattle grew strong and the horses were lively, and Florence planted a garden at the side of the house with the focused determination of someone reclaiming ground. She grew tomatoes and squash and beans, and a row of sunflowers purely for the aesthetic argument they made against the sky, and Calvin built her a proper garden fence to keep the deer out, and Thomas helped her plant seeds with the intense, solemn concentration of a 4-year-old, who understands that something important is happening even if the full details have not been made clear. Della Marsh came out to the South Fork for a visit in June and sat on the porch in the afternoon and watched Thomas and Eli building something complicated in the yard and Catherine sleeping in the shade nearby. And she looked at Florence with an expression that was entirely warm and entirely without surprise. "You are happy," she said, not a question. "I am," Florence said. And then, because it was Della and had always been Della, more than I thought it was possible to be. Della smiled. "I knew," she said. Florence looked at her. "You did not know, you hoped." "I knew," Della said comfortably and reached for her lemonade. In the years that followed, life on the South Fork continued to accumulate the kind of richness that does not make for dramatic stories but that makes for full and genuine lives. Calvin's reputation for horsework continued to grow, and he eventually was training horses for ranches as far away as Santa Fe, which meant occasional trips away that Florence managed with the competence of a woman who had never required a man's presence to run her household, but who also genuinely liked having him in it. Thomas grew toward 10, and then 12 with the relentless velocity of children, becoming over those years someone who combined his mother's verbal precision with his father's capacity for concentrated attention, and who was, to his parents' mingled pride and occasional exasperation, almost entirely fearless. He fell out of trees and off horses and into the creek with an even-handedness that suggested the universe had accepted him as someone who required regular contact with gravity. Catherine was different, quieter and more interior, with a quality of watchfulness that reminded Florence sometimes of the way Calvin had looked that first evening at the Millhaven Social, standing by the wall and observing the room with careful interest. She was an avid reader, which pleased Florence considerably, and she had, by the time she was 4, developed a particular passion for the carved horses her father made, which she arranged and rearranged on her windowsill according to a system of organization that only she fully understood but that she explained at length to anyone who asked. Eli continued with them into his early 20s and eventually rode west to try his luck in California, leaving with 3 horses, a year's wages, and Florence's careful letter of recommendation, which she wrote with genuine respect for the person he had become during his years on the South Fork. He wrote back from California twice a year with an irregularity that was entirely characteristic, and Calvin and Florence read his letters at the kitchen table with the affection you have for people who have been part of your best years. There was another child, a second son, born in the spring of 1889. They named him William, after nobody in particular, but because both Calvin and Florence felt that it was a name that asked something of a person, and they thought that was not a bad thing to build into a name. William arrived in April, as the wildflowers were coming up, and he was from his first breath an entirely serene child, which his mother and father both found slightly disorienting after the enthusiastic turbulence of Thomas and the watchful intensity of Catherine, but which they quickly came to regard as its own specific gift. Mary Brenner, Calvin's mother, came from St. Louis in the summer of 1890, making the journey at 70 years old with the confident disregard for inconvenience that Calvin had clearly inherited. She arrived with 2 trunks and a bird in a cage and opinions about everything, and she and Florence liked each other immediately and completely, which was not a surprise to either of them because they had been corresponding for 7 years and knew each other well. She stayed for 3 months, sleeping in the room Florence had furnished with her father's books, and she spent her mornings in the garden and her afternoons on the porch watching the grandchildren with proprietary satisfaction. She held little William in the evenings and told Florence about Calvin as a child, stories that Calvin accepted with a resigned expression and that Florence received with great delight, and there was a particular pleasure in this, in the way a person's past and present and future sat together around a kitchen table in the lamplight. Mary Brenner went back to St. Louis in September, promising to return, which she did the following summer and the one after that. The bird cage came with her each time, the bird inside it changing, because the birds did not always survive the journey, which she noted with regret and complete unsentimental practicality. She died in the winter of 1894, in her sister's house in St. Louis at 74, and Calvin received the letter in February with a stillness that Florence recognized as grief arriving in the particular way it arrived in him, quietly and entirely. She sat with him that evening and did not require him to talk, and later he did talk, about his mother and his boyhood in Missouri and the farm and his father, and the quality of his mother's particular love, which had been demanding and generous in equal measure, and had given him, he thought, most of what he knew about how to love anyone properly. Florence took his hand and held it and thought that this was what love was made of. Not only the good evenings on the hillside above the creek and the dancing at the Grange Hall and the moments of perfect happiness, but also this, sitting together in the February dark while grief did its honest work and being unwilling to be anywhere else. The decade turned, and with it Millhaven changed in the ways that small western towns changed in the 1890s, growing some and losing some. The railroad that had been promised since Florence could remember finally arriving in 1891, which brought new families and new commerce and new complications. The school, still run by Clara Briggs, expanded to 2 rooms and eventually hired a second teacher. There was a new bank and a new hotel and a barber shop that Calvin attended with slightly more regularity than previously, which Florence noted without comment and Della noted with considerable comment. The water rights issue flared again in the early 1890s, not with Dutton, who had sold and moved on, but with a new configuration of larger cattle interests that were trying to consolidate the water access along the South Fork. Calvin navigated this with the same methodical quality he brought to legal difficulties, and Florence helped, because her father's books included several on contract law and property rights that she had read with thorough attention, and between them they understood the documentation well enough to consult effectively with the county attorney, and the South Fork water rights remained intact. Florence thought occasionally about the injustices that surrounded them, the way the land had come to be what it was, the history that was written in the soil of Colorado, the people who had been here before any of this was the West of anyone's story. She was not able to resolve these things, nobody in Millhaven could, but she taught her children about them honestly, because she believed that understanding what had happened was a beginning even when it was not enough. Thomas, at 14, asked her once why the land had been taken the way it had, and she said, "Because of greed and the belief that some people matter less than others, which is a belief that causes most of the worst things that happen in the world." He was quiet for a while and then said, "But we live here." And she said, "Yes, we do, and what you do with where you live is part of who you are." Calvin, who had been listening from the doorway, came in and sat at the table, and they talked about it for a long time, all 3 of them. And Florence thought that these conversations were as important as anything else they gave their children, the willingness to sit with the difficult questions, even when the answers were not simple or complete. In the fall of 1894, Della Marsh organized a reunion of sorts at the Grange Hall, calling it simply an autumn social in the tradition of the original, and Florence and Calvin attended, and it was full of people they had known for years, and the fiddle player was the son of the original fiddle player, which felt like its own kind of continuity. Florence wore a dark rose dress that was very different from the pale blue one of 12 years before, and Calvin came to stand beside her at the edge of the lamplight, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and she thought about that first evening, the man by the wall who did not ask her to dance, who asked her to leave with him instead. "Do you want to dance?" she said. He looked at the floor and then at her. "I would rather walk outside with you," he said. as I believe was established some years ago to be the superior option." She laughed. The too large laugh, fully and without restraint, and Calvin watched her with the expression she had learned across 12 years to read as love, the specific and particular kind that belonged only to the two of them. They walked out of the Grange Hall into the October night, and the stars were extraordinary as they always were, and the aspens along the creek had gone gold again, as they always did, and Calvin took her hand and she took his, and they walked along the path on the side of the hill above the hall, the same path they had walked the first night, and everything was different from that night and nothing essential had changed. "I have been thinking," he said when they had walked a little way. "About what?" she said. "About the east pasture," he said. "I want to plant it in hay next spring. I think we can get 2 cuttings if the weather holds." She looked up at the stars and smiled. "That sounds right," she said. "I also," he said, and his voice was quieter now, "think about that first evening more than you might expect." She turned to look at him. The moonlight was good enough that she could see his face clearly. "Do you?" she said. "I think about the way you looked when you walked in," he said. "And I think about how certain I was, almost immediately, that I needed to talk to you, not dance with you." "Talk to you? You were certain," she said. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," he said. She stopped walking and faced him fully. The music from the Grange Hall reached them faintly, a reel, and the creek was a sound below them in the dark, and the mountains were everywhere. "I was terrified," she said, "when I said yes, not of you, of the size of it." "I know," he said. "I was too. You did not show it." "I showed it to you," he said. "Eventually, you learned to read it." This was true. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read any landscape you love, by paying attention, by walking its terrain in all its seasons. She stepped forward and put her arms around his neck in the same way she had among the aspens the day he proposed, 12 years before, and he put his arms around her and held her with the same completeness as always, and they stood like that in the dark above Millhaven while the fiddle played and the stars turned their slow wheel overhead. "Let us go home," she said eventually, into the collar of his coat. "Yes," he said. They were 50 years old before Florence sat down one evening to count what they had built, and found that the counting took a long time. 3 children, all healthy and specific and entirely themselves. Thomas, who had gone to study law in Denver at 17, and who came home for every Christmas without fail, and who was reading for his bar examination with the same tenacious precision he had brought to everything since childhood. Catherine, who had surprised everyone by becoming the finest rider on the South Fork, and who was beginning to understand that she had her father's particular gift for horses, and intended to do something with it. William, who was 10 and still as serene as he had been born, who had his mother's dark hair and his grandfather's quiet, sharp eyes, and who had lately decided that what he wanted more than anything was to teach, and who practiced on anyone who held still long enough, explaining things with the patient clarity of someone who has thought through what he wants to say before saying it. The South Fork property had grown across the years. Calvin had purchased the adjacent 50 acres when they came available in 1888, and the land was well managed and productive, and the horsework had become something significant in the region, something that bore his name in a way that was respected. He was past 60 now and moved with slightly more deliberation than previously, but the quality of his attention had not diminished at all, and the horses still came to him with the trust that cannot be demanded or purchased, only earned. Florence's hair had gone gray, mostly at the temples and then increasingly everywhere, and she had allowed this without any particular resistance, because she had the deep contentment of a woman who knows what she looks like and does not particularly mind. She had lines at the corners of her eyes from 40 years of Colorado sun and laughter, and she thought these were an honest account of her life, and she was not ashamed of any entry. She had been since William's birth, the informal school for the South Fork community, and over 20 years she had taught more children than she could count, sitting around the table in the sitting room among Thomas Redmond's books. Some of them were now adults with children of their own, and those children came to Florence's table too, And there was in this continuity something that felt, to Florence, like the truest thing she had done. The line of knowledge passed from hand to hand through a room full of books and children. Della Marsh came to the South Fork in the spring of the year Florence turned 50, and they sat on the porch in the April warmth and drank coffee and watched the mountains and talked about everything and nothing in the way of women who have been friends for 30 years and need no particular agenda. "Do you remember," Della said, "the evening you left the social with a man you had spoken to for less than a minute?" "I remember," Florence said. "I have told that story no fewer than 40 times," Della said. Florence smiled. "I know, Reverend Marsh told me. You tell it every time someone is being too cautious about love." "It is an instructive story," Della said without apology. Florence looked across the yard to where Calvin was working with a young horse near the paddock, the same way he always worked, with the same quality of patient, concentrated calm, and the horse was listening in the way that only happened when trust had been established, and the spring light was very clear and golden on the grass. "It worked out," Florence said. "It worked out splendidly," Della said. That summer, when the aspens were just beginning their first hints of gold, Calvin came in from the paddock on an August evening with dust on his boots and his hat pushed back and found Florence in the kitchen writing a letter. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and leaned against the counter and watched her write for a moment. "Florence," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn across 33 years, the specific one she had learned on that first hillside above Millhaven, the one that meant he was about to say something he had thought carefully before saying. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am aware every day of what my life is." She set down her pen. "Calvin." "I do not say it enough," he said. "I know I do not, but I am aware of it. What you are and what we built. I do not take it as ordinary." Florence looked at him in the August evening light in the kitchen of their home, this man who had stood by a wall 33 years ago and refused to dance with anyone because he was waiting for something he could not quite name, who had looked at her and known in that particular way he knew things that she was what he had been watching for. "You show me," she said. "Every day you show me." He nodded once, accepting this. "Besides," she said, "you said yes." He raised an eyebrow. "I said yes." "I asked if you wanted to dance at the reunion," she said, "and you said you would rather walk outside, which is, I have always maintained, the more romantic option." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I said yes to leaving with you in the first place. You said yes to me. We said yes to each other," she said. He came across the kitchen and she stood, and he put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him. And they stood in their kitchen in the August evening that smelled of coffee and the South Fork, and the particular warmth of a house that had been lived in fully. And outside the horses moved quietly in the paddock, and the mountains were golden in the last light, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be, and they were both entirely aware of it. Thomas came home for Christmas that year and passed his bar examination in the spring, and he was offered a position with a law office in Denver that he accepted. And he came back to the South Fork to tell them with the look of a person who is very pleased with something and also a little frightened of it, which Florence recognized as the correct response to the beginning of a life you have worked for. Calvin shook his son's hand and held it for a moment and then pulled him in, briefly and without ceremony. And Thomas, who was 26 and entirely adult, let himself be held for a moment before stepping back. Catherine, who was 20, had by that spring entered into a considered and mutual understanding with the youngest son of the Vance family from the North Ranch, a young man named Robert who had been coming around for 2 years with such steady and respectful persistence that even Calvin, who assessed young men interested in his daughter with the impartial seriousness he brought to horses, had concluded that the persistence was genuine rather than performative. Florence had concluded the same thing, and additionally that Robert Vance looked at Catherine the way that mattered, which was the way she had articulated to Della 30 years before and had found no reason to revise since. They married the following spring, Catherine and Robert, in the same church where Florence and Calvin had married, and Reverend Marsh's son, now the minister himself, officiated with the same cheerful gravity his father had brought to these occasions. Florence sat in the front pew and held Calvin's hand and watched her daughter be married with full and open heart, and the small garnet ring was on her finger where it had lived for 32 years. William, at 11 and 12 and 13, continued to grow into the person he was becoming with the serene determinism he had always shown, and Florence taught him and argued with him and watched him with the specific pride of a parent who recognizes in a child something entirely themselves and entirely right. He would teach, she was certain of it, and he would do it well, and that too was its own kind of continuity. The South Fork property went quietly and beautifully into its third decade of the Brenners' care. The east pasture did indeed produce 2 cuttings of hay in favorable years. The horse work continued to bring people from considerable distances, and Calvin had by now trained Eli's replacement, a young woman from the neighboring county who had appeared one spring with a letter of introduction and an obvious gift, and whom Calvin taught with the same thorough patience he had taught everything, and who turned out to be one of the best decisions the South Fork had made in years. On a September morning in 1914, which was a September of enormous consequence in the world beyond their valley, but which arrived in Millhaven with the usual changing of the light and the aspens going gold, Florence Redmond Brenner sat on the porch of the house on the South Fork and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge. She was 56 years old. Calvin was beside her in the other chair, as he was most mornings, with his coffee and his hat not yet on, his gray-streaked hair catching the early light. The mountains were pink and then gold, and then the full impossible blue of a Colorado September morning. Thomas was in Denver. Catherine was across the valley with Robert and their 2-year-old son, Charles, who was loud and emphatic and unmistakably his grandmother's grandchild. William was at the school in town, the same school Florence's father had built and that Florence had run, teaching the children of Millhaven with the patient clarity that Florence had always known was in him. The world was large and complicated, and the news from the East was frightening, and Florence held that awareness alongside everything else she carried, the gratitude and the love and the knowledge of how quickly things could change. And she understood, as she had always understood, that you do not earn peace by ignoring difficulty, but by being fully alive inside it. Calvin reached across and took her hand on the arm of the porch chair without looking at her, the way you reach for something you know is there, and she turned her hand and held his. The mountains were gold now. The aspens along the creek were shaking in the early wind. The horses moved in the paddock with the easy elegance of animals who have been treated well and know it. Florence thought about a Grange hall full of lantern light, 32 years ago. She thought about a man by a wall who did not ask her to dance, who asked her to leave with him instead, who said the truest thing she had heard all evening, which was that she looked to him like a woman who would rather be somewhere else. She thought about how she had said yes instantly, without the caution that every sensible part of her counseled, because something more fundamental than caution had recognized something in him that it had been looking for. She had been right. She was right. The sun was all the way up now, clear and warm, and the day was beginning in all its specific, ordinary, irreplaceable beauty, and Florence Redmond held her husband's hand on their porch on the South Fork with everything she knew, and everything she had built, and everything she loved arranged around her like a country she had chosen and been chosen by. And she was, in the deepest and most accurate sense of the word, exactly where she was supposed to be. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. And it was